The grand hall of Aelithor shimmered with light that seemed to breathe, pulsing tendrils of gold and emerald that danced across walls carved from a single massive tree thousands of years old. High Lord Careth stood at the center, his robes flowing like liquid moonlight, his ageless face carved from marble contempt. Before him knelt Ambassador Wren, a human in travel-worn leather, hands trembling as he presented a long wooden case. The elf's laughter rang out like shattering crystal, echoing through the hall where his court, immortal beings who had walked the world for millennia, joined in the mockery. This? Careth lifted the simple iron tube from the case with 2 fingers as if it might soil him. This crude stick is your kingdom's great achievement? We forge blades that sing with starlight. We weave spells that reshape mountains, and you bring me a metal pipe. The other elves erupted in fresh laughter, some doubling over, others wiping tears from eyes that had witnessed empires rise and fall. Wren's jaw clenched, his knuckles white. He wanted to speak, to explain, but Careth waved a dismissive hand. Your people live and die in the span of a heartbeat. 80 pathetic years. We have trees older than your oldest stories. Return to your king and tell him this. When you've had 1,000 years to learn what real power means, perhaps then we'll take you seriously.
6 months before that humiliation, smoke rose from the chimneys of Harrowdeep, a human city built into the side of a mountain range where winter never quite released its grip. The buildings were stone and iron, practical and plain, nothing like the flowing architecture of the elven forests or the crystal spires of the dwarven underground cities. In the war room of the royal keep, King Aldrich stood before a map covered in red markers, each one representing a village destroyed, a town burned, a border breached. His face was lined with exhaustion, his beard more gray than black now. Around the table sat his remaining generals and advisors, all bearing the same haunted look of men who knew they were losing. The elves of Aelithor had declared war over a border dispute so minor it barely qualified as an insult, but everyone in that room knew the truth. This wasn't about borders. It was about sending a message. The elves wanted to remind the world that despite humanity's recent expansion, despite their growing cities and advancing technologies, they were still nothing compared to the ancient races. General Thorn slammed his fist on the table, the sound sharp in the heavy silence. We've lost 3 battalions in 2 weeks. Their archers never miss. Their mages turned our cavalry charges into funeral pyres. And their warriors, he trailed off, not needing to finish. Everyone had heard the reports. Elven warriors who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of combat moved through human formations like dancers, each motion ending a life. We need to sue for peace, one of the advisors said, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever terms they demand, we pay. This war will end with our extinction otherwise. King Aldrich closed his eyes, the weight of the crown suddenly feeling like it might crush his skull. They were right. Every military advisor, every strategic calculation, every battlefield report pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity couldn't win this war. The door to the war room opened without a knock. A woman entered, her presence commanding immediate attention despite her modest appearance. Bastine Varn wore the simple coat of a royal engineer, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her hands stained with soot and oil. She wasn't supposed to be in this meeting, but the guards at the door had learned long ago that when Bastine decided something needed to happen, obstacles had a way of becoming irrelevant. She crossed to the king without ceremony and placed the leather-bound journal on the table. "Don't surrender," she said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who'd solved an impossible equation. "Give me 4 months, Your Majesty. 4 months, and I'll give you a weapon that will make the elves bleed." The room erupted in protests and questions, but King Aldrich held up his hand for silence. He'd known Bastine since she was a child, had watched her solve problems that stumped scholars twice her age, had seen her turn theoretical designs into working machines that changed how his kingdom functioned. If she said she could do something, she could do it. But this? What kind of weapon? He asked carefully. Bastine opened the journal to a page filled with intricate diagrams and calculations. At the center was a drawing of a simple tube with a strange mechanism at one end. "The elves mock our short lives, Your Majesty. They say we accomplish nothing because we don't have centuries to perfect our crafts. But they're wrong. We don't need centuries. We need to think differently. While they've spent 1,000 years perfecting the bow, I've been working on something else, something they've never imagined. I call it a rifle." The generals leaned forward, squinting at the diagrams. It looked like nothing: a metal tube, some springs, a hammer mechanism. "How does it work?" Thorn asked skeptically. Bastine's smile was sharp. "It throws a piece of metal faster and farther than any bow. Fast enough that their armor won't matter. Far enough that their archers can't reach us. Accurate enough that a farmer with 2 weeks of training can kill an Elven Lord who spent 3 centuries mastering combat." She looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. "They think our short lives make us weak. I'm going to show them that it makes us desperate. Desperate enough to innovate. Desperate enough to break every rule they think governs warfare. Desperate enough to win."
The Royal Forge District occupied the lowest levels of Harrowdeep, where natural hot springs provided endless heat and the mountain itself formed the anvil upon which humanity's future would be shaped. Bastien had commandeered the largest forge, evicting 3 master smiths and their apprentices to make room for her team. Now the space rang with the sound of hammers on metal, the hiss of steam and the constant scratch of chalk on slate as calculations were adjusted and readjusted. She'd handpicked her team, not the most prestigious craftsmen, but the most innovative. Myrick, who designed a new bridge system that cut construction time in half. Isolde, who'd invented a water pump that could draw from twice the depth of conventional designs. Finn, barely 20 years old but possessed of an almost supernatural understanding of metallurgy. Together, they worked 16-hour days, sleeping in shifts, eating at their workbenches. The first prototype was a disaster. The barrel exploded on the 3rd test firing, sending shrapnel into the sandbag wall Bastien had wisely erected. The second attempt jammed after 2 shots, the mechanism seizing from heat expansion she hadn't accounted for. The third fired successfully 5 times before the barrel warped. Each failure taught them something new, each lesson bought with burned hands, singed eyebrows, and mounting frustration. Isolde developed a new cooling system using water channels in the barrel itself. Merrick perfected the rifling, spiral grooves inside the barrel that would spin the projectile and make it fly straight and true. Finn experimented with different metal alloys, finding a combination of iron and carbon that could withstand the explosive forces without becoming too brittle. By the end of the first month, they had a working prototype that could fire 20 shots before needing maintenance. King Aldrich visited the forge on a cold morning, his presence announced by guards that Bastien waved off impatiently. She was in the middle of a demonstration, the latest rifle mounted on a testing stand. "Watch," she said simply, adjusting her protective goggles. The target was a wooden post wearing a captured suit of elven armor, beautiful, lightweight, enchanted to turn aside normal blades. Bastien loaded a small lead ball wrapped in paper, poured a measure of black powder down the barrel, and set the mechanism. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap that made everyone except the forge workers flinch. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the wooden post had been knocked backward, the elven armor sporting a hole straight through the breastplate, the metal around it blackened and bent. The lead ball had passed completely through and buried itself in the stone wall behind. The king stared at the ruined armor, his expression unreadable. "How many can you make?" he asked finally. Bastien did quick calculations in her head. "With this forge alone, maybe 50 by your deadline. But I need more forges, more workers, more resources. If you give me access to the mining guild's foundries and the smithing quarters workshops,
If you authorize me to recruit every capable metalworker in the city, regardless of their current contracts, I can give you 500 rifles. Maybe 1,000 if we get lucky and nothing else explodes. The king turned to his guard captain. Give her whatever she needs. Every forge in Harrowdeep is now under royal mandate. Any smith who refuses to join this effort will be charged with treason. He looked back at Bastien, and for the first time in months, hope flickered in his eyes. You've given me the first good news since this damned war started. But Bastien's expression remained serious. The rifles are only part of it, Your Majesty. A weapon is useless if your soldiers don't know how to use it, if your generals don't understand its capabilities, if your tactics don't change to account for what it can do. I need your permission to completely restructure how your army fights. No more cavalry charges, no more shield walls. Everything has to change. The king was quiet for a long moment, understanding the weight of what she was asking. Warfare was tradition, honor, tactics refined over centuries. She was asking him to throw it all away and trust the judgment of a 35-year-old engineer who'd never commanded troops in battle. Finally, he nodded. Whatever you need, he said again, and the words felt like a sacred oath. Teach them, change them. Just make sure that when we face the elves again, we make them regret ever looking down on us.
The parade grounds north of the city transformed into something between a military camp and an experimental laboratory. Bastien had requisitioned 300 soldiers, not the elite units, but common infantry, men and women who'd grown up on farms, in shops, in the trades, the kind of people the elves would dismiss without a second thought. She stood before them on the first day, holding one of the rifles, and announced something that made the veteran sergeants choke on their morning tea. Forget everything you know about warfare. None of it matters anymore. The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Many had trained for years, some had seen combat. Now this soot-stained engineer was telling them it was all worthless? But Bastien didn't care about their doubts. She cared about results. She demonstrated the rifle's capabilities personally, firing at targets at ranges that made the soldiers whisper in disbelief. 50 yards, 100 yards, 200 yards, a distance where even elven archers started losing accuracy. Each shot punched through armor, through wooden shields, through stone. Then she handed rifles to the soldiers and began the real training. Loading became muscle memory drilled through endless repetition. Open the paper cartridge with your teeth. Pour the powder down the barrel. Drop the ball. Use the ramrod to seat it. Pour a pinch of powder in the pan. Cock the hammer. Aim. Fire. Over and over until they could do it in their sleep, in the dark, under pressure. The first time they fired live ammunition, half the soldiers flinched so hard they missed entirely. By the end of the first week, they were hitting targets. By the end of the second, they were hitting specific points on those targets. General Thorne observed the training with a mixture of fascination and horror. This wasn't warfare as he understood it. There was no glory here, no honor, no test of individual skill, just cold mechanical efficiency. It's like watching assembly line workers, he muttered to his aide, but Bastien overheard him. Exactly, she said, appearing at his elbow. That's exactly what it is. The elves think warfare is an art perfected over centuries. I'm turning it into industry, mass production of death. She gestured at the soldiers practicing their reloading drills in perfect synchronization. Each of these people, individually, couldn't stand against a single elven warrior in fair combat, but they don't need to. Put them in formation, give them proper positioning and support, and they become something else entirely. Not warriors, not heroes, a machine. The general watched as Bastien demonstrated new tactical formations, thin lines instead of dense blocks, emphasis on fields of fire rather than melee engagement, coordinated volleys that turned the battlefield into a killing zone. The elves will charge with their cavalry, she explained, moving wooden blocks on a tactical map. They always do. They believe in the decisive shock of the charge, the terror of seeing perfect warriors bearing down on you. Our old formations would try to meet them with pike and spear. That won't work anymore. Instead, we form firing lines here and here. They charge, we fire. First rank shoots, kneels to reload. Second rank shoots while first reloads. Third rank shoots while second reloads. If we do it right, we create a continuous wall of lead that nothing can cross. Their immortality won't matter. Their centuries of training won't matter. Their magic won't matter if they're dead before they can cast it. The aide looked pale. It's murder. Where's the honor in this? Bastien turned to him, and her expression was cold. Honor! They burned 3 villages last week. They killed everyone. Children, elderly, didn't matter. They crucified the survivors along the road as a warning. Where was the honor in that? She stepped closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. The elves started this war because they wanted to remind us of our place. They wanted to teach us that our short lives mean we'll never be their equals. I'm going to teach them something different. I'm going to teach them that 80 years of desperate, furious innovation beats 1,000 years of comfortable superiority. Every single time. The training continued through rain, through snow, through the night when Bastien ordered torches lit so they could practice in darkness. And slowly, the soldiers stopped looking like farmers and shopkeepers playing at war. They started looking like something new, something the world had never seen before.
In the ancient forest city of Aelithor, High Lord Careth lounged in his private garden, where flowers bloomed that had first opened their petals before human civilization existed. He read the intelligence reports with mild amusement, occasionally laughing at particularly absurd details. The humans were building, what, metal tubes? Training their soldiers to point sticks at the enemy? It was almost charming in its pathetic desperation. "They're calling them rifles," his intelligence master, Ledain, reported. She was old even by Elven standards, having served Careth's great-grandfather. Some sort of projectile weapon. The reports are unclear on the mechanism, but apparently they've shut down normal military training entirely to focus on these devices. Careth waved a hand dismissively. "Let them waste their time. Metal tubes won't stop our cavalry. Toys won't defeat magic. This war will be over before summer." But Ledain's expression remained troubled. "My lord, our agents report something unusual. The humans are training with an intensity we've never observed before. They're working day and night. And their engineer, this Bastien Varn, she has a reputation for unconventional solutions." The High Lord finally looked up from his reports, registering the genuine concern in his intelligence master's voice. "You're worried about a human engineer? A mortal whose entire life won't equal a single season of our existence?" He stood, his robes flowing around him like water. "Ledain, you've served my family for 7 centuries. Surely you've learned by now that human desperation isn't the same as human capability. They're dying. They know it, so they grasp at anything that might delay the inevitable. These rifles are probably just modified crossbows with a fancy name." Ledain bowed, but her eyes held doubt. "Shall I send agents to acquire one of these weapons, to determine exactly what we're dealing with?" Careth considered this, then shook his head. "No. Let them keep their secrets. Let them think they have some surprise that will change the course of the war. It will make their defeat all the more devastating when they realize that 1,000 years of accumulated magic and martial prowess cannot be overcome by a few months of frantic tinkering." He returned to his couch, picking up a wine glass filled with something that shimmered like liquid starlight. "Besides, their desperation amuses me. Schedule a delegation to Harrowdeep. I think I'd like to see these weapons myself. Let's offer them a chance to surrender. And when they refuse, let's have them demonstrate their great innovation. I could use a good laugh." The delegation arrived at Harrowdeep 3 weeks later, during a break in the winter storms. 6 elven nobles on horses that seemed to glide rather than walk, their armor polished to mirror brightness, their bearing radiating the supreme confidence of beings who'd never known defeat. Ambassador Wren met them at the gates, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. He'd been the one negotiating peace terms when the war started, the one who'd tried to prevent this catastrophe. Now he was relegated to greeting the people who'd made his life's work meaningless. "High Lord Careth sends his greetings," the delegation leader announced, her voice carrying the musical quality common to elves but laced with condescension. "He offers your king one final chance to surrender, unconditional, immediate. We'll allow your people to keep their lives, though of course certain concessions will be required." Ren listened to the terms: massive reparations, permanent military restrictions, surrender of territories, acknowledgement of Elven supremacy in all diplomatic documents. Terms designed not just to end the war, but to humiliate, to break humanity's spirit so thoroughly they'd never dare challenge Elven authority again. When she finished, Ren smiled, and the expression was so unexpected that the Elven delegation actually shifted uncomfortably. "I'll deliver your terms to the king, but first, since you've traveled so far, perhaps you'd like to see what we've been working on. His Majesty would be honored to provide a demonstration of our new military capabilities." The delegation exchanged glances. This should be entertaining, watching the humans show off whatever pathetic innovation they'd convinced themselves would save them. "Very well," the leader agreed. "Let's see these famous rifles we've heard whispers about."
The demonstration took place in a cleared field outside the city walls, the ground still covered in patches of snow despite the afternoon sun. Bastien had arranged everything precisely: target posts at varying distances, a firing line where 10 soldiers stood with their rifles, and an observation platform where King Aldrich sat with his generals. The Elven delegation was provided with comfortable seats and refreshments, treated with all the courtesy due to foreign dignitaries, which only seemed to make them more contemptuous. They lounged like people watching a children's play, expecting to be mildly entertained at best. Bastien stood before them, holding one of the rifles. She looked plain compared to the elves' otherworldly beauty, her clothes practical, her face lined with exhaustion from months of work, her hands scarred from forge accidents. But her eyes held something that made the more perceptive elves sit up slightly: absolute certainty. "Thank you for attending," Bastien said, her voice carrying across the field. "What you're about to see represents 4 months of work by the finest craftsmen and engineers in Harrowdeep. We call it a rifle. It operates on principles of controlled explosive force, channeled through a precisely manufactured barrel to propel a projectile at extremely high velocity." The Elven leader laughed, a sound like silver bells. "You've invented a complicated way to throw rocks? How innovative!" The other elves joined in her laughter. Bastien didn't smile. "The first target is at 50 yards, standard combat distance. Please observe the armor mounted on the post. That's your design, I believe. Captured from a fallen warrior last month." The laughter died. Putting their sacred armor on a practice target was an insult. The Elven leader's hand drifted toward her sword. Bastien ignored the growing tension and raised the rifle to her shoulder. The motion was practiced, economical, the result of countless hours of training. She aimed, holding her breath, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was shockingly loud, nothing like the whisper of an arrow or the hum of magic. It was violent, sudden, brutal. Smoke erupted from the barrel. The lead ball covered 50 yards in a fraction of a second and punched straight through the Elven armor's breastplate, the metal designed to turn aside dragon claws, offering no more resistance than parchment. The post fell backward, the armor ruined. Silence. The elves stared at the destroyed armor, their expressions shifting from contempt to confusion to the first stirrings of concern. "The second target is at 100 yards, double the effective range of your longbows." She handed the rifle to one of the soldiers, a former miller named Garrett who'd never touched a weapon before this training began. He loaded with practiced efficiency, raised the rifle, and fired. Another thunderous explosion, another ruined target. "The third target is at 200 yards. At this distance, your archers can barely hit a stationary target. Your magic starts losing accuracy. But watch this." She nodded to another soldier. 5 rifles fired in quick succession, a rolling thunder that echoed off the city walls. All 5 targets at 200 yards fell, armor pierced, wood splintered. The Elven delegation was no longer lounging. They stood now, staring at the targets, their immortal minds trying to process what they'd just witnessed. "That's impossible," one of them breathed. "The speed, the force required." Bastien turned to face them directly. "You've had 1,000 years to perfect the bow. We've had 4 months to invent something completely new. You call our short lives pathetic. We call them motivating." The Elven leader recovered her composure, but her voice had lost its condescension. "This is
Impressive, genuinely impressive. But surely you understand that this doesn't change the fundamental balance of power. We have magic. We have warriors who have trained for centuries. We have numbers? Bastien interrupted. We calculated that too. Current estimates put your military forces at roughly 50,000 warriors. Harrowdeep alone can field 80,000 troops. And with rifles, we don't need them to be master warriors. We need them to point, aim, and pull a trigger. Skills that can be taught in weeks, not centuries. She gestured at the soldiers on the firing line, common people transformed into an equalizing force. Your millennia of accumulated skill won't save you when a farmer can kill you from 200 yards away. Your magic won't matter when lead balls move faster than you can cast. Your immortality becomes a liability when you have so much to lose and we have everything to gain. The delegation left shortly after, their horses moving faster than they arrived, their faces pale even by elven standards. Ambassador Wren watched them go and allowed himself a small smile. The message had been delivered. Let Kareth laugh now.
High Lord Caerith listened to his delegation's report with growing disbelief and then anger. The serene garden around him seemed to darken, the eternal flowers dimming as his mood soured. "Metal tubes that throw projectiles through armor," he said, his voice dangerous. "Weapons that give humans twice the range of our bows? And you're telling me this seriously?" The delegation leader, stripped of her earlier contempt, nodded gravely. "My lord, I witnessed it myself. Their engineer. She's created something we've never encountered. The force, the speed, the accuracy. It's unlike anything in our archives." Caerith stood abruptly, his robe swirling. "Then they've stumbled upon some lost artifact, some ancient human magic from before the Sundering. It doesn't matter. Magic will still triumph. Our wards can deflect projectiles. Our cavalry can close the distance before their weapons matter. Our immortality means we can afford patient tactics while they grow old and die." But Lydane, the intelligence master, stepped forward with another report. "My lord, there's more. They're not just building a few of these weapons. Our latest reconnaissance indicates they've converted every forge in the city to production. They're making thousands, and they're training their entire army in new tactics, formations we've never seen, strategies that account for extended range and rapid-fire capabilities." She laid out sketches on the council table, diagrams her spies had risked their lives to obtain, showing the firing line formations, the reload sequences, the coordinated volley systems. "They're not planning to fight us in traditional warfare. They're planning to shoot us down before we can engage. It's revolutionary, and it might actually work." The other council members stirred uneasily. They were ancient beings, most over 1,000 years old, accustomed to the comfortable certainty that elven superiority was a law of nature, as unchangeable as gravity. Caerith studied the diagrams, his mind racing. He'd lived for over 3,000 years, had commanded armies in wars against dragons and demons, had seen empires rise and crumble. But this was something genuinely new. "Very well," he said finally. "If the humans want to play with new toys, we'll remind them why age and experience still matter. Assemble our war council. I want our finest tactical minds analyzing these weapons and developing countermeasures. I want our mages researching protective spells against high-velocity projectiles. And I want our best craftsmen examining the principles. If humans can create such weapons in 4 months, imagine what we can do with centuries of magical enhancement." He looked around at his council, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their ancient eyes. "But most importantly, I want this war ended quickly, before they have time to refine these weapons further, before they can mass-produce them in truly devastating numbers." The campaign plan came together over the next week. They would launch a massive assault on Harrowdeep itself, bypassing the smaller human settlements and striking directly at the source of these weapons. 50,000 elven warriors, the largest force assembled in 3 centuries, would march on the human capital. They would bring their most powerful mages, their elite cavalry, their legendary champions, and they would bring something else, a weapon they'd hoped never to use again. Deep in the vaults of Aelithor, sealed behind wards that had stood for 2,000 years, was a dragon egg. Not a true dragon, but a war beast,
a creature bred and enchanted for a single purpose, overwhelming destruction. Kyrith stood before the sealed vault, feeling the malevolent presence beyond the door. They'd used such creatures once before, in the War of the Sundering. The devastation had been so complete that the Elven Council had voted to never release them again. "Unseal it," Kyrith commanded. His council members exchanged worried glances. "My lord, the cost," one began. "I know the cost," Kyrith's voice cracked like a whip. "I was there when we used them last. I know what they do, what they become. But I also know what happens if we let humanity develop these weapons unchecked. This isn't just about winning a war anymore. It's about maintaining the natural order. The humans have stepped beyond their boundaries. They've created weapons that allow the short-lived to challenge the eternal. If we don't stop this here, if we don't demonstrate the absolute futility of resisting us, what happens in a century when they've refined these weapons further? In 2 centuries? In 3 centuries? He turned to face his council fully. "We are immortal. We have all the time in the world. But that's precisely why we must act decisively now, before their desperate innovation outpaces our comfortable superiority."
The elven army moved through the forest like a tide of silver and steel, 50,000 warriors marching in perfect synchronization. They moved faster than human armies could manage, covering in days what would take mortals weeks. Cavalry units ranged ahead, securing routes and eliminating any human scouts unfortunate enough to spot them. Mage Corps maintained weather wards that kept the winter snow from touching them, marching in a bubble of eternal spring while the world around them froze. At the center of the formation, surrounded by triple layers of protective units, rumbled the Dragon Wagon, a massive cart pulled by enchanted beasts, carrying something that radiated heat and malevolence. The war beast was growing inside its egg, feeding on the ambient magic the mages channeled into it, preparing to be born into a world it would burn. The elven soldiers avoided looking at it, veterans remembering old nightmares, younger warriors sensing something fundamentally wrong, even if they didn't understand why. In Harrowdeep, warning bells tolled across the city. Scouts had spotted the army 2 days out, an impossible-to-hide force moving with terrifying speed toward the capital. The King's Council convened an emergency session, but this time there was no panic, no talk of surrender. Bastien stood at the head of the table, pointing to positions on a detailed map of the approaches to the city. They're coming straight up the main valley. No attempt at subtlety or flanking maneuvers. They're confident, probably overconfident. They think their numbers and magic will simply overwhelm us. She traced lines on the map with her finger. We'll position our forces here, here, and here. Firing lines on the elevated positions. Reserve units behind the main walls. And here, she tapped a narrow point in the valley. We've spent the last 3 weeks preparing a surprise. General Thorne studied the positions and nodded slowly. The old warrior had been skeptical of Bastien's methods at first, but he'd become her strongest supporter after watching the training exercises. "We're abandoning the traditional defensive strategy entirely," he noted. "No cavalry to meet their cavalry. No shield walls. Just the firing lines. Because we don't need anything else. They'll charge. They always charge. Their entire tactical doctrine for 3,000 years has been built around the superiority of elven warriors in close combat. They can't conceive of a battle where close combat doesn't happen, so we make sure it doesn't." She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. They're coming here expecting to fight a war. Instead, they're going to learn what an ambush feels like when the ambush is 3,000 rifles all firing at once. The army mobilized throughout the night. Soldiers moved to their assigned positions in the dark, rifles loaded and ready, powder kept dry under oiled canvas. Engineers checked the special preparations in the valley narrows, barrels of black powder buried under carefully arranged rocks, fuses running back to protected firing positions, a trap designed by minds that understood explosive force better than any elven mage. Bastien moved among the troops, checking equipment, offering quiet words of encouragement.
her presence radiating confidence, even as her mind raced with 1,000 worries. One damp fuse, one jammed rifle, one moment of panic could unravel everything. The soldiers watched her, drawing strength from her certainty. She'd promised them they could win. She'd shown them how. Now it was time to prove it. As dawn broke on the day of battle, the Elven army crested the ridge overlooking the valley. From their elevated position, they could see Harrowdeep in the distance, its walls looking pitifully inadequate against their vast numbers. High Lord Careth sat on his war beast, not the dragon creature still gestating in its egg, but a great elk whose antlers glowed with captured starlight. He surveyed the battlefield and allowed himself a smile. The humans had positioned troops on the hillsides, thin lines that looked desperately undermanned. This would be over by midday. "Sound the advance," he commanded. Trumpets blared, their notes carrying across the valley with magical enhancement. The Elven cavalry moved forward first, 5,000 mounted warriors, the thunder of their hooves shaking the ground. Behind them came the infantry, perfectly disciplined ranks, moving like a single organism. And behind them, the mage corps prepared their spells, reality itself bending to their ancient will. The cavalry entered the valley narrows at full gallop, their warriors whooping with battle joy, certain that within minutes they'd be among the human lines, their blades drinking deep. The narrow point was a perfect place for a cavalry charge. The walls of the valley would funnel them directly at the human positions, building momentum, making them an unstoppable hammer. This is where the humans would break, where they'd realize that metal tubes were no match for 3,000 years of warrior perfection. Then Bastien gave the signal. Soldiers manning hidden positions lit the fuses, and the valley narrows exploded. 50 barrels of black powder detonated simultaneously, a force of destruction that made the rifle shots seem like whispers by comparison. The sound was apocalyptic, a roar that shook the mountains themselves. Rock and earth erupted upward, the carefully placed charges turning the valley floor into a crater. The Elven cavalry at the front ceased to exist, vaporized by forces they couldn't comprehend. Those behind them were buried under tons of falling rock as the valley walls collapsed inward, the narrows becoming a killing ground, choked with smoke and dust, and screaming horses.
The smoke cleared slowly, revealing devastation that made even the most battle-hardened Elven veterans stare in horror. Where there had been a valley floor, now there was a crater 30 feet deep and 100 yards wide. Where there had been 5,000 cavalry, now there were scattered remains and the writhing forms of the few who'd been far enough back to survive the blast, but not far enough to escape the falling rocks. The proud charge had been stopped cold, not by opposing warriors or magical shields, but by controlled explosive force buried in the earth itself. High Lord Careth felt something he hadn't experienced in over 2,000 years, genuine shock. His immortal mind struggled to process what had just happened. An entire cavalry division, warriors who trained for centuries, eliminated in a single moment by, what? Underground explosives? The tactical implications hit him like a physical blow. If the humans could do this, if they understood explosive force well enough to weaponize it at this scale, then every assumption he'd made about this war was wrong. "Reform ranks," he commanded, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Infantry, forward! Mage Corps, prepare defensive wards!" The Elven army responded with the discipline of centuries, but their advance was more cautious now. Soldiers picking their way around the crater, eyes scanning the ground for any sign of more buried surprises. They expected the humans to be panicking, to be shocked by their own weapons' effectiveness, to be unprepared for the next phase of battle. They were wrong. Bastien stood on the command platform behind the main defensive line, watching through a distance glass as the Elven forces reorganized. Perfect. The explosion had done exactly what she'd intended. Stopped the cavalry charge and forced them to bunch up in the valley's confined space. Now they were packed close together,
advancing cautiously but still advancing, moving toward the carefully prepared killing ground. She raised her hand, waiting for the perfect moment, watching as more and more elven warriors funneled into the valley. The elven infantry was within 200 yards of the human positions when Bastienne dropped her hand. 3,000 rifles fired simultaneously. The sound was like the end of the world, a rolling thunder that seemed to last forever as the first rank fired, dropped to their knees to reload, and the second rank fired over their heads, then the third. The coordinated volley that Bastienne had drilled into her soldiers for months became a continuous wall of death. Lead balls traveling faster than sound tore through the elven ranks. Armor that had been enchanted by master craftsmen, shields that could turn aside dragon fire, personal wards maintained by centuries of magical study. None of it mattered. The projectiles were too fast, too numerous, too relentless. Elven warriors who'd survived battles against demons felt like wheat before a scythe. The survivors tried to charge forward, tried to close the distance where their blades and magic would matter, but they were trying to run through a hurricane of lead. For every yard they advanced, dozens fell. The elven mages attempted countermeasures, throwing up protective barriers, trying to teleport warriors past the firing lines, launching offensive spells toward the human positions. Some of it worked. A few barriers held for precious seconds. A handful of warriors made it through to crash into the human lines. But Bastienne had planned for that too. Reserve units with rifles positioned behind the main lines shot down any elves who broke through. The mages themselves became priority targets, identifiable by their elaborate robes and the glow of active spellcasting. Riflemen trained specifically for long-range precision shooting picked them off one by one, learning that a mage concentrating on a spell was a perfect stationary target. The magical tide that should have swept the human positions away flickered and died as the practitioners fell. Within 20 minutes, the elven advance had stalled completely. Within 30, it had become a rout. High Lord Kareth watched his immortal army break and run, and something inside him broke too. 3,000 years of certainty, of absolute confidence in elven superiority shattered in half an hour. He activated the dragon wagon, his hand shaking as he channeled magic into the egg. It wasn't ready yet. The war beast needed another week to fully develop, but he had no choice. They were losing. The ancient, eternal elves were losing to human farmers with metal tubes and black powder. The egg cracked and something emerged, a twisted, half-formed thing with scales like midnight and eyes like burning coals. It was barely conscious, operating on pure instinct and rage, but it was powerful. The war beast's roar shook the valley, a sound from nightmares given voice. It spread wings that were more membrane than flesh and launched itself into the air, heading toward the human positions with murder in its incomplete mind. Perhaps this would turn the tide. Perhaps this ancient weapon would remind the humans why the immortal races ruled the world. The war beast swept over the battlefield, and soldiers on both sides felt primordial terror grip their hearts. It was a creature from the world's infancy, from a time before civilization, when survival meant hiding from things that ate mountains. Its shadow falling over the firing lines caused some soldiers to drop their rifles and run. Others stood frozen, minds unable to process what they were seeing. The creature dove toward the main defensive position, jaws opening to reveal rows of teeth like swords, preparing to unleash the destructive breath weapon that was the signature of its kind. This was what the elves had been holding in reserve. The trump card that would prove human innovation was still no match for ancient power. But Bastienne had planned for this, too. She'd known from intelligence reports that the elves had something catastrophic in their vaults. She didn't know exactly what it would be, but she'd planned for the general category of massive flying threat. On her signal, 50 riflemen who'd been training specifically for aerial targets aimed upward. These weren't normal soldiers. They were hunters, people who'd spent their lives shooting birds and game, people with an instinctive understanding of how to lead a moving target. The rifles they carried were slightly modified, with longer barrels for increased range and accuracy. They'd practiced on flying targets for weeks, arrows shot into the air, clay discs thrown skyward, anything that would prepare them for this moment. Now they aimed at the diving nightmare and fired in a coordinated volley. Most of the shots missed. Hitting a flying target was exponentially harder than hitting a stationary one, but the war beast was large, and it was diving straight toward them, making itself a bigger target with each second. 4 lead balls struck home. 1 hit a wing membrane, tearing through the fragile tissue. 2 hit the creature's flank, punching through scales that weren't fully hardened yet. The 4th, by pure luck, struck the beast's throat. The war beast's dive turned into a tumbling fall. It crashed into the ground just short of the human lines, the impact creating a crater and sending up a cloud of dust and snow. For a moment, there was silence. Then the creature began thrashing, wounded but not dead, its tail smashing through defensive positions, its claws gouging trenches in the earth. It was still incredibly dangerous, still capable of killing dozens before it expired. Soldiers scattered, some firing their rifles at point-blank range, while others tried to get clear of its death throes. Bastiad grabbed a rifle from a nearby soldier and ran toward the creature, her mind racing to everything she knew about draconic anatomy from the old texts. The throat shot had been perfect. It had severed something vital, but the war beast's physiology was keeping it alive through sheer supernatural fury. She needed to finish this before it recovered enough to become airborne again. She circled around to the creature's blind side, where its thrashing had exposed its flank. There, between the scales where the armor hadn't fully formed, she could see the membrane protecting its heart. The text said that war beasts had redundant organs, that even a heart shot wouldn't necessarily kill them, but it would slow them down. She raised the rifle, aimed at the exposed membrane, and fired. The lead ball punched through into the creature's chest cavity. The war beast's thrashing intensified for a moment, then suddenly stopped. It collapsed, its breathing ragged and shallow, its eyes losing their fire. Bastien walked closer, keeping the rifle trained on its head, watching for any sign of renewed aggression. The creature's eyes focused on her, and for a moment she saw something that wasn't just animal rage, intelligence, ancient and malevolent, recognizing her as the architect of its defeat. Then the light faded, and the war beast was dead. The silence that followed was profound. The elven army had been routed, their cavalry destroyed, their infantry broken, their mages killed, and now their ultimate weapon lay dead in the snow. The soldiers on both sides stared at the fallen beast, unable to believe what had just happened. High Lord Caerith sat on his war elk, staring at the carnage, at the valley floor littered with his people's bodies, at the impossible defeat his immortal mind was struggling to accept. He'd lived for over 3,000 years. He'd fought in the War of the Sundering, had personally killed a demon lord, had been present at the creation of artifacts that reshaped reality. And today, a human engineer who'd lived for less than 40 years had completely dismantled his army using principles he didn't even fully understand. Around him, the surviving elven commanders waited for orders, but he had none to give. How do you command a retreat when you don't understand how you lost? 3 days after the battle, Ambassador Wren rode alone into what remained of the elven encampment. He carried a white flag and a message from King Aldric. Not terms of surrender, which was what he'd expected to be carrying when this war started, but an offer of ceasefire. The elven camp was a shadow of its former glory. The survivors had retreated to a defensive position 10 miles from the battlefield, their numbers reduced from 50,000 to barely 15,000. They moved like ghosts, these immortal beings who'd suddenly learned what mortality felt like. Wren was escorted to High Lord Caerith's tent, and what he found there shocked him. The Elf Lord stood alone, without guards or advisors, staring at maps that no longer made sense. When he looked up at Wren, the ambassador saw something he'd never seen in an elf's eyes before. Defeat. Not just military defeat, but a fundamental defeat of worldview. "Your king wishes to gloat?" Caerith asked, his voice hollow. Wren shook his head. "His Majesty wishes to discuss terms. Neither of our peoples benefit from continued war." He sat down without being invited, too exhausted from months of stress to maintain diplomatic protocols. "You came to teach us our place, to remind us that human lives are too short to accomplish anything meaningful. Well, we've learned something different. We've learned that we can match you, not by living longer, but by living harder, by innovating faster, by refusing to accept that the natural order is unchangeable." He pulled out a scroll and unrolled it on the table. These are our terms. They're generous considering. You withdraw all forces from human territories. You pay reparations, not massive ones, but enough to rebuild the villages you burned. And you acknowledge, in a formal treaty, that humanity has the right to defend itself with whatever technology we develop. Kerith read the terms, and a bitter laugh escaped him. You could demand so much more. You've broken our army. You've killed a war beast. Do you have any idea how rare those are? How irreplaceable? You could march on Aelithor itself, and we couldn't stop you. Ren leaned forward. We could, but we won't. Because, despite everything, we don't want to rule over you. We don't want to become what you tried to make us into. We just want to be left alone to build our civilizations in peace. Your people have centuries to perfect arts and magics. We have decades to make our mark on the world. Let's stop measuring which is superior and just accept that both have value. The Elf Lord studied the human ambassador, seeing something he'd never fully appreciated before, the fierce determination that came from knowing your time was limited. Elves could afford to be patient, to let grudges simmer for centuries. Humans had to act now, had to solve problems immediately because they might not be alive to see them through otherwise. Your engineer, Kerith said suddenly. Bishin Vorn. I wish to meet her. The request surprised Ren, but he nodded. I'll see if she's willing. He stood to leave, then paused. My lord, if I may offer a thought, this doesn't have to be the end of relations between our peoples. We could trade, exchange knowledge. Your magic, our technology. Imagine what could be accomplished if we worked together instead of trying to prove superiority. Kerith waved a hand dismissively, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Not hope exactly, but curiosity. Perhaps the human was right. Perhaps there was more to learn from these brief-lived creatures than he'd ever imagined. Bring your engineer. I have questions about her weapons, and I have apologies to offer. Bastien arrived the next day, escorted by a full platoon despite the ceasefire. She walked into Kerith's tent wearing her engineer's coat, her hands still stained with gun oil and powder residue, looking completely out of place among the elven luxury. But she carried herself with quiet confidence, the bearing of someone who just changed the world and knew it. The Elf Lord stood to greet her, a gesture of respect he'd rarely shown to mortals, and gestured for her to sit. You've cost me over 30,000 lives. Warriors who trained for centuries, mages who studied for millennia. And you did it in less than an hour, with weapons you invented in 4 months. I find myself oscillating between rage and admiration. Bastien met his eyes steadily. Your armies cost us thousands of innocent lives. Farmers who'd never held a weapon. Children who'd never seen war. Don't ask me to feel sorry for warriors who knew exactly what they were signing up for. She leaned back in her chair. You came to our lands to prove a point about superiority. You wanted to teach us that our short lives made us inferior. Instead, you learned something different. You learned that we can match you. Not by living longer, but by living harder, by innovating faster, by refusing to accept that the natural order is unchangeable. She pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page covered with calculations and diagrams. The mathematics are actually quite simple. Force equals mass times acceleration. Contain the explosion, channel it through a barrel, and you create enormous acceleration. The hard part wasn't the theory, it was the engineering. Making barrels that wouldn't explode, developing powder that burned consistently, creating mechanisms that could withstand repeated firing. The Elf Lord looked at the calculations, and something shifted in his expression. This is elegant. Brutal, but elegant. You've taken a fundamental force and bent it to your will through pure engineering. He looked up at her. In my archives, we have spell formulas that took centuries to perfect. Magical equations that require years of study to understand. And you've accomplished something comparable in months using nothing but metal and chemistry. Bastien nodded. That's the difference between our peoples, Lord Kerith. You have the luxury of time, so you perfect things slowly. We have the pressure of mortality, so we innovate rapidly. Neither approach is superior. They're just different responses to different circumstances. The problem started when you tried to use your approach to judge ours. Will you share this knowledge? Kareth asked, suddenly. Your rifles, your explosive techniques? Will you sell them to other kingdoms, other races? It was a crucial question, and Bastien knew it was coming. That depends on you. If you sign the peace treaty, if you agree to leave human lands alone, then no, we'll keep this technology to ourselves. We have no interest in arming the world. But if this war continues, if other elven kingdoms or dwarven holds decide they want to teach humanity our place, she let the threat hang unspoken. Then every human kingdom will have rifles within a year. Every border will be defended by weapons that make your warriors' centuries of training irrelevant. Is that what you want? An arms race where desperate innovation will always beat comfortable superiority? The Elf Lord was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. No, that's not what I want. He stood and extended his hand in the human fashion. You have your peace, Engineer Vaughn, and you have my word that the Elven kingdoms will respect human sovereignty from this day forward.
The treaty was signed 1 month later in the great hall of Harrowdeep's castle, with representatives from every major kingdom, human, elven, dwarven, and others in attendance. The news of the battle had spread across the known world like wildfire, carried by traders and refugees and soldiers who couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. Everywhere the story went, it spawned the same reaction: disbelief, then curiosity, then a fundamental reassessment of humanity's place in the world order. The hall was packed with dignitaries who'd come to see for themselves if the rumors were true. King Aldrich sat at the head of the great table, looking 10 years younger than he had at the war's start. Beside him sat Bastien, still in her engineer's coat, still looking uncomfortable with the attention, but refusing to dress the part of a court dignitary. High Lord Kareth sat across from them, his ancient face composed, but his eyes holding a new wariness, the expression of someone who'd learned that immortality wasn't the same as invincibility. The treaty itself was surprisingly simple. The elves would withdraw from all human territories, pay modest reparations, and acknowledge humanity's right to self-defense through any means they developed. In return, humans agreed not to sell or trade their new weapons technology to other kingdoms, and both sides established a formal diplomatic framework for resolving future disputes without warfare. But the real significance of the treaty wasn't in its specific terms, it was in what it represented. For the first time in recorded history, an immortal race had acknowledged that humans weren't just short-lived primitives to be managed or dominated. They were equals, capable of innovation and achievement that could rival anything the ancient races had accomplished over millennia. As the various representatives signed the document, Bastien noticed the dwarf lord watching her intently. After the ceremony, he approached with obvious purpose. Engineer Varn, I am Thorgrund Ironshaper, master of the Eastern Forges. I must know, these rifles of yours, the explosive principles you've discovered, how much of it came from dwarven mining techniques? Bastien smiled. About 30% of the foundational concepts came from studying your people's blasting powder, yes. We adapted it, refined it, found new applications. That's what we do. We take existing ideas and push them in new directions because we don't have time to invent everything from scratch. Thorgrund stroked his beard thoughtfully. You've created something remarkable and terrifying. My people have been using blasting powder from mining for 5 centuries, and it never occurred to us to weaponize it at this scale. Too busy perfecting the traditional crafts, I suppose. He looked at her seriously. This changes everything, you understand. Not just warfare, but the entire balance of power. The young races, humans, halflings, the freeborn tribes, suddenly have a way to defend themselves against peoples who've ruled through centuries of accumulated knowledge. Is that a bad thing? Bastien asked quietly. Should the world be ruled by those who live longest? Or should achievement matter more than age? The dwarf lord laughed, a deep, rumbling sound, spoken like someone who knows her days are numbered and refuses to waste them. You've given me much to think about, Engineer Varn. Much to think about, indeed. He bowed formally and walked away, leaving Bastien to wonder what innovations might emerge from the dwarven forges in the coming years. The treaty signing concluded with a formal dinner that lasted into the night. Ambassadors and nobles mingled, forming new alliances and trading centers of power that had been rigid for millennia. And in the middle of it all, Bastien slipped away quietly, making her way back to the Forge District where her team was already working on the next generation of improvements. Because that was the other lesson the elves had learned. Human innovation didn't stop just because you'd caught up. It accelerated.
2 years after the Treaty of Harrowdeep, the Royal Engineering Academy opened its doors in a new building constructed specifically for the purpose. Bastien stood at the entrance on opening day, watching as the first class of students arrived, young men and women from across the kingdom, selected not for their noble birth or magical potential, but for their aptitude with mathematics and mechanics. This was her true legacy, she thought. Not the rifles, not the victory, but this, an institution dedicated to the principle that innovation mattered more than tradition, that clever engineering could rival ancient magic, that a short life spent creating something new was worth more than a long life spent perfecting what already existed. The curriculum she designed covered everything from basic metallurgy to advanced chemistry, from mechanical principles to explosive dynamics. Students would learn not just how to build weapons, but how to think, how to look at existing systems and see ways to improve them, how to take principles from one field and apply them to another, how to prototype and test and fail and learn. King Aldrich attended the opening ceremony, giving a speech about how Harrowdeep had always been a city of builders and makers, and how the academy represented the formalization of that spirit. But Bastien knew the real reason he supported the academy so strongly: insurance. The rifles had given humanity a temporary advantage, but other kingdoms were already developing their own versions. The dwarves had approached it with designs for hand cannons. The halflings had created something they called a blunderbuss. Even some of the elven kingdoms, swallowing their pride, had begun researching gunpowder weapons. The only way to maintain an edge was to keep innovating, and the only way to do that was to train the next generation of engineers. General Thorn, now retired but serving as the Academy's military advisor, stood beside her, watching the students file in. Strange to think that 5 years ago I was ready to surrender to the elves, ready to accept that human civilization would always be subordinate to the ancient races. You weren't wrong to think that, Bastien said quietly. Given the information available at the time, surrender made sense. The elves had every advantage except one. They didn't need to innovate, so they didn't. We had no choice. She gestured at the academy building. This is how we make sure we always have that advantage, not by hoarding knowledge, but by spreading it, by making sure that every generation has people who know how to look at the impossible and find a way to make it work. The general nodded slowly. You've changed the world, Bastien, not just with the rifles, but with this idea that innovation can be taught, that anyone with aptitude can learn to create new things regardless of their birth or circumstances. The ancient races spent millennia believing that only those with long lives could achieve greatness. You've proven them wrong. Inside the academy, the first lecture was beginning. Professor Merrick, Bastien's old forge partner, stood before a classroom of eager students. Welcome to Advanced Mechanical Principles, he announced. Today, we're going to discuss the theoretical limits of explosive propulsion and why everything you think you know about those limits is probably wrong. Because the most important thing you'll learn at this academy isn't any specific technique or formula, it's that the word impossible usually just means nobody's figured it out yet. The students leaned forward, pens poised over notebooks, ready to absorb knowledge that would have been considered secret military intelligence just a few years ago. Bastien watched through the classroom window and smiled. This was how you changed civilization, not with a single invention, but with an institution that would produce hundreds of inventors. Not with one lifetime of achievement, but with a system that would compound achievement across generations. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor at her home. Ambassador Wren, looking travel-worn but excited. he announced without preamble, "I've just returned from the Western Kingdoms. Bastian, you need to see what's happening out there. Every human kingdom is building academies modeled on yours. The merchant guilds are sponsoring research into steam power for ships. The farming communities are experimenting with mechanical harvesters. Everywhere I went, people are asking the same question. If we can match the elves in warfare, what else can we do that they said was impossible?" Bastian felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. That's wonderful and terrifying. Innovation without wisdom can be dangerous. Ren laughed. That's why they all want you to visit, to consult, to teach, to help guide this transformation. You've become something of a legend, the engineer who proved that human ingenuity could triumph over immortal superiority.
5 years after the Treaty of Harrowdeep, representatives from the Elven Kingdoms arrived with an unusual request. They wanted to establish an exchange program with the Engineering Academy. Elven students would study human innovation techniques, and human students would learn Elven magic theory. The proposal shocked everyone who heard it, but Bastian saw the logic immediately. The elves had learned their lesson about dismissing human achievement, but they'd also recognized an opportunity. If they could combine their centuries of magical knowledge with human innovation speed, they could create something entirely new. The Academy Council debated for weeks before agreeing to a trial program. 10 Elven students would attend for a 2-year term, and 10 human students would study at the Luminous College in Aelithor. The cultural exchange would be carefully monitored, and all research would be shared equally between the kingdoms. Bastian personally interviewed the Elven applicants, curious what would motivate immortal beings to seek education from mortals. The first Elven student she interviewed was named Lorandal, barely 200 years old, practically a child by Elven standards. "Why do you want to study here?" Bastian asked directly. The young elf met her eyes with surprising intensity. "Because I watched from the ridgeline during the battle. I saw your weapons tear through our army. I saw our war beast fall. And I understood something that my elders refused to admit. We've become stagnant. We have all the time in the world, so we never feel urgency. We perfect things slowly because we can afford to. But you've proven that urgency breeds innovation in ways that comfort never will." She leaned forward. "I want to learn how you think, how you look at problems, how you create solutions in months that would take us centuries. Not so I can build better weapons, so I can bring that innovative mindset back to my people and shake us out of our comfortable superiority." Bastian approved all 10 Elven applicants and watched with fascination as they integrated into the academy. The culture clash was immediate and profound. Human students worked in intense bursts, sleeping little, pushing themselves to complete projects as if time itself were the enemy. Elven students approached problems with methodical patience, willing to spend months on theoretical groundwork before attempting practical application. Initially, the two groups frustrated each other. Humans thought elves were unnecessarily slow, elves thought humans were recklessly hasty. But gradually, something remarkable emerged. Projects that combined human speed with elven thoroughness achieved results neither group could manage alone. A human engineer's rapid prototyping, combined with an elven mage's careful enchantment process, created devices that were both innovative and reliable. The Academy's workshops became laboratories of collaborative creation, mixing magic and mechanism in ways that had never been attempted before. The breakthrough came during a joint project to develop a new transportation system. Human engineers had designed a carriage that could be propelled by controlled steam explosions, a fascinating concept, but plagued with safety issues and fuel inefficiency. Elven students suggested incorporating stabilization wards and efficiency enchantments. The resulting design was revolutionary, a vehicle that combined mechanical propulsion with magical enhancement, capable of traveling at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. When Bastian saw the prototype, she understood that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just humans proving they could match the ancient races. This was the beginning of a new paradigm where innovation and tradition worked together, where mortal urgency met immortal patience and created something neither could achieve alone. The old hierarchies, based purely on lifespan and accumulated knowledge, were crumbling, replaced by a new recognition that different perspectives had different values. But not everyone celebrated this collaboration. A faction of conservative Elven Lords, led by a council member named Aelithor, began speaking out against the exchange program. They argued that sharing magical secrets with short-lived races was dangerous, that human innovation, combined with elven magic, would create weapons of unimaginable destruction, that the natural order was being violated. Aelith sent a formal complaint to High Lord Kararith demanding the program be shut down. The letter was blunt. We risk giving mortals access to powers they lack the wisdom to wield responsibly. Their brief lives mean they think only of immediate gains, not long-term consequences. This exchange must end before we create a catastrophe. Kararith forwarded the letter to Bastien with a simple note. How would you respond to this? Bastien spent a week crafting her response, knowing that what she wrote would influence not just the exchange program, but the entire future of human-elven relations.
Bastien's response to Aelith was delivered as a public lecture at the Engineering Academy, with representatives from every major kingdom in attendance. She stood before the assembled crowd, the conservative Elven Lords sitting in the front row with a skeptical expression, and began with a simple question. Lord Aelith argues that humans lack the wisdom to wield power responsibly because our lives are too brief. But I would ask, what is wisdom? Is it simply the accumulation of years? Or is it the application of learning, the recognition of consequences, the willingness to consider others before ourselves? She gestured to a display behind her, showing the joint projects from the exchange program. These devices were created by humans and elves working together. Each brought different strengths: human innovation speed, elven theoretical depth. But more importantly, each brought different perspectives on responsibility. Human students approach each project knowing they have limited time to make their mark on the world, she continued. This creates urgency, yes, but also a deep awareness that our actions have consequences we'll live to see. We can't afford to create problems we won't be around to solve. We must think carefully about what we build because we'll face the immediate results. She turned to face Aelith directly. Elven students approach projects with the confidence that they have centuries to refine and perfect. But I've noticed something interesting. That same confidence sometimes breeds complacency. If you have forever to fix mistakes, you're less careful about making them in the first place. Some of the worst magical disasters in recorded history were caused by immortal beings who thought they had time to correct errors that spiraled out of control. The audience stirred, uncomfortable with this direct challenge to conventional wisdom about the superiority of long-lived races. What we're learning through this exchange, Bastien pressed, is that wisdom isn't about lifespan, it's about perspective. Humans bring the perspective of mortality, which teaches us to value each decision and consider immediate consequences. Elves bring the perspective of immortality, which teaches patience and long-term thinking. Neither is superior. Both are necessary. And when we combine them, we create solutions that are both innovative and responsible, both urgent and sustainable. She pulled out a device from the display, a water purification system that used mechanical filtration enhanced by purification magic. This was designed by Lyrindel, one of your elven students, working with Marcus, a human engineering apprentice. Marcus pushed for rapid prototyping to solve an immediate crisis: contaminated water in a district of the city. Lyrindel insisted on thorough testing to ensure the enchantments wouldn't degrade over time. The result? A system deployed in 3 months instead of the 3 years a purely elven design would take, but with safeguards that ensure it will function reliably for centuries. You fear that we'll create weapons of terrible power, Bastien said, her voice softening. That fear is valid. But the answer isn't to hoard knowledge and pretend that separation keeps us safe. The rifles I designed prove that innovation can't be stopped or controlled by restricting who has access to ideas. The answer is collaboration, ensuring that when powerful things are created, they're created by people from different backgrounds working together, checking each other's assumptions, bringing different wisdom traditions to bear on difficult questions. She looked around the auditorium. Lord Aelith, you argue that humans lack wisdom because we're young. I argue that no race has a monopoly on wisdom, and that the greatest danger isn't in sharing knowledge. It's in the arrogance of believing that only you know how to use it responsibly. The auditorium erupted in applause, but Vaelith stood slowly, his ancient face unreadable. A pretty speech, Engineer Varn, but words are easy. Prove to me that this collaboration produces wisdom and not just clever devices. Show me that mortals and immortals working together create something that neither could achieve alone, something that makes the world genuinely better, not just more advanced. Bastien met his challenge with a slight smile. Very well, Lord Vaelith. Give me 6 months. I'll show you exactly that. The Elven Lord nodded curtly and left, leaving Bastien to wonder what she just committed herself to. But as she looked around the Academy's students, human and elven, dwarf and halfling, all working together with shared purpose, she knew exactly what she needed to prove. Not that humans could match immortals in innovation, but that collaboration between brief lives and eternal ones could create something that transcended both.
6 months later, the delegation reconvened in Harrowdeep's Great Square, but this time they came to witness not a weapon demonstration, but something entirely different. The entire square had been transformed into a garden unlike any seen before. Trees that glowed with soft light, plants that purified the air, water features that collected and filtered rain, pathways that heated themselves to prevent ice in winter. But the marvel wasn't just aesthetic. This was a complete ecological system designed by teams of human engineers and elven naturalists working together, combining rapid innovation with patient magical cultivation. The garden would produce food year-round, purify the city's water supply, provide medicine from specially cultivated plants, and serve as a public space that improved both physical and mental health for everyone who visited. Lord Vaelith walked through the garden slowly, his ancient eyes taking in every detail, his hands occasionally reaching out to touch a plant or test the flowing water. The trees were engineered by Lyrindale, Bastien explained, walking beside him. She combined traditional elven growth magic with a new technique developed by one of our human botanists, accelerated directed evolution. Instead of waiting centuries for magical trees to mature, we can grow them in years, while retaining all their beneficial properties. She led him to a central fountain where the water sparkled with an unusual clarity. The filtration system uses mechanical principles I developed combined with purification enchantments refined by the Luminous College. It can clean water faster than any purely magical system, but it will last longer than any purely mechanical one. Each approach covers the weaknesses of the other. Vaelith dipped his hand in the water, watching it flow through his fingers. This is impressive, genuinely impressive. But it's still just a garden, Engineer Varn. A beautiful one, certainly, but hardly the proof of wisdom you promised. Bastien smiled. Look closer, Lord Vaelith. Look at what this represents. For millennia, your people created magical wonders, gardens that existed for centuries, artifacts that shaped reality itself, beautiful, permanent, perfect, but also exclusive. Only the wealthy, only the powerful, only those with access to elven magic could benefit from them. Meanwhile, humans built practical solutions, aqueducts, sewers, public works that served everyone but required constant maintenance and eventually failed. She gestured around the square. This garden combines both philosophies. It's beautiful and permanent like elven magic, but it's also public and practical like human engineering. Every citizen of Harrowdeep has access to it. The poorest farmer can walk through these paths, the sick can use the medicinal plants, children can play here safely, and it will last for centuries because we built it together. Your people's long-term thinking combined with our drive to serve immediate needs. More than that, Bastien continued, leading him to a demonstration area where students were teaching citizens how to maintain the systems. We've designed it so that humans can understand and care for it. The magic isn't mysterious or inaccessible. It's explained, taught, maintainable, And the mechanical systems aren't crude and temporary. They're elegant and durable. Future generations will be able to modify and improve this garden because we've combined innovation with sustainability. She turned to face the Elven Lord fully. You asked me to prove that collaboration produces wisdom. Here's my proof. Wisdom isn't just about creating something powerful or beautiful. It's about creating something that serves others, that lasts, that can be understood and improved by those who come after us. That requires combining mortal urgency with immortal patience, human practicality with elven artistry. Neither approach alone could have produced this. Velith was quiet for a long time, walking through the garden again, watching families enjoying the space, observing students explaining the systems to curious citizens. Finally, he returned to where Bastien waited and bowed, a deep, formal bow that acknowledged equals. I came here prepared to argue that this exchange program was a mistake. I believe that our peoples were too different, that mortal brief lives and immortal perspectives could never truly mesh. You've shown me I was wrong. He straightened. This garden will stand for centuries, but its true legacy isn't the trees or the water features. It's the proof that different peoples with different strengths can create something neither could achieve alone. That's not just innovation, Engineer Varn. That's wisdom. He looked around at the students, human, elven, dwarven, all working together without regard for lifespans or hierarchies. You've accomplished something in your brief life that will echo for generations. You've proven that achievement isn't measured in years lived, but in value created. The ceremony celebrating the garden's completion drew representatives from every kingdom. King Aldrich gave a speech about the new era of collaboration. High Lord Caerith spoke about the evolution of elven perspectives, and Thorgrund Ironshaper discussed how the dwarven kingdoms were developing their own exchange programs. But the moment everyone remembered came when Bastien was called forward to speak. She stood before the crowd, looking out at faces from every race and nation, and felt the weight of what they'd accomplished together. 5 years ago, I stood in a forge designing weapons because that was the only way to make the immortal races take us seriously. Today, I stand in a garden designed for peace and public benefit. That transformation, from weapons to wonders, that's the real victory of the past 5 years. The elves mocked our pathetic 80-year lifespans. They said we couldn't accomplish anything meaningful because we didn't have centuries to perfect our crafts. But they were measuring accomplishment wrong. It's not about how long you work. It's about what you create, who you help, and what you leave behind for others to build upon. She gestured around the garden. In one human lifetime, we've gone from being dismissed as inferior to being recognized as equals. We've transformed warfare, established institutions of learning, and proven that innovation can match tradition. But more importantly, we've learned that neither approach is superior. They're complementary. Mortal urgency and immortal patience, human innovation and elven artistry, brief lives burning bright and eternal lives burning steady. So yes, we only get 80 years while elves get thousands, but in those 80 years, we've changed the world. We've proven that achievement isn't about time, it's about determination. We've shown that a short life lived with purpose and passion can accomplish more than a long life lived in comfortable superiority. And together, mortal and immortal working side by side, we can create wonders that neither could imagine alone. That's our legacy. Not weapons or wars or treaties, but the proof that everyone, regardless of how long they live, has something valuable to contribute. And that when we work together, respecting our differences instead of using them to claim superiority, there's no challenge we can't overcome. The applause that followed seemed to shake the very stones of Harrowdeep, and in that moment, standing in a garden that combined the best of all peoples, Bastien understood that they'd achieved something more profound than military victory. They'd rewritten the fundamental assumptions that governed their world. They'd proven that the measure of a life wasn't its length, but its impact. That 80 years of fierce innovation could indeed accomplish more than 1,000 years of comfortable tradition, and that the real power came not from proving one approach superior to another, but from bringing them together to create something entirely new. The garden would stand for centuries, but the idea it represented, that collaboration transcended hierarchy, that wisdom came from diversity, that every lifespan had equal value, that would echo through the ages, changing civilization itself. And someday, when Bastienne's brief mortal life had ended, when she was dust and memory, people would still walk through this garden and understand what she proven, that it's not how long you live, it's what you do with the time you have.